We are good to go. We're recording. I'll hand it over to you. Thanks, Eva.
Sure. So I'm apologizing right off the bat if I have to take a couple of pauses throughout the presentation. I'm getting over a cold and cough, so I'm still coughing occasionally. But yeah, we're going over the project-based voucher program. I work in the Office of Housing Voucher Programs, which is the headquarters office that does a lot of the policy formulation and you know, wrestling with the tough questions that we get on the project-based voucher program. I like to go through this presentation as much as possible, just start to finish, because there's just so much to cover in the PBV program. So, you know, if possible, hold questions to the end. We'll do verbal questions. I probably won't notice if you put something in the chat, just doesn't seem to pop out at me while I'm in presentation mode. And if you really have just like an absolutely burning question, you got to talk about it, you can interrupt me, that's okay. I will definitely make sure that people get copies of the presentation. I really like the PowerPoint for the reason that it provides citations to all of the sections being covered. So it's a really good way to actually go and look up the full PBV rules and processes on a specific topic. Obviously, the slides are just abbreviated explanations. You do have to go to those direct sources in order to get the full rules. Okay, so what are the primary benefits of the project-based voucher program? And we have a lot of housing authorities that love this program. We have, I think, about 300,000 project-based voucher units at this time. So people like it because PBVs improve access to neighborhoods of opportunity. PHAs are required to select units that deconcentrate poverty, which provides that access. There's an exemption there for RAD, though. Keep that in mind. PBVs also expand the availability of affordable rental housing by reserving units for assisted families for a long period of time. PHAs can prioritize and incentivize projects that meet specific needs in the community, such as a need for accessible units or supportive services offered in connection with a project. PBVs also provide owners with more security to develop affordable housing because PBVs provide predictable market rate rental income that can cover the debt on the project, which improves owners' financing options in a lot of cases. The PBV program is normally a discretionary use of a PHA's Housing Choice Voucher annual contributions contract funding. So that just means that a PHA can choose to use some of its voucher funding for a PBV program and enter into a HAP contract or multiple HAP contracts with a project owner or multiple project owners so that units will be reserved for voucher participants. A little different for RAD. When a PHA chooses to convert a property through RAD, the PHA is committing to project-based the project using voucher funds specifically awarded for the purpose. So it's not quite discretionary anymore. The major difference between the PBV program and the HCV program is instead of a voucher holder being entitled to housing assistance payments or HAP in any eligible unit he or she chooses, instead the owner receives HAP for specific units during the term of the contract, while the voucher participants housed in the assisted units move in and out. PHAs that implement a PBV program have to follow the statutory requirements at 1437 FO13 of the U.S. Housing Act, the PBV regulations at Part 983 of the Code of Federal Regulations, their own administrative and PHA plans, so their own policies, and the PBV contract requirements. HUD also currently governs 2 topics using Federal Register notices. That's the Davis-Bacon rules for development activity that occurs during the HAP contract. Very limited application there, but it's kind of outside of the CFR, located in a Federal Register notice, so something to be aware of. And then also the subsidy layering review guidance. That's also located in a Federal Register notice. And I think it's actually about to be updated too, but we'll see what happens. I've also just added PIH Notice 2017-21 on this slide. It's not really a rule, right? It's guidance, but it's the most complete guidance we have on the PBV program. Really, really helpful document. It goes through a huge number of the PBV program components in detail and also has some really, really handy appendices. So good document to keep in mind. You do have to keep in mind when you're thinking about the governing rules of the PBV program that if a particular PBV project involves special program components or sources of funds, including RAD, or VASH, tenant protection vouchers, in some cases, some of these PBVs will have certain PBV rules waived, or some additional rules may apply. And so it's really important for the PHA to reference the requirements for those components or funds in addition to the PBV rules if they happen to be using those components or funds. One thing that's important to remember is that where there's no PBV specific rule, basically the HCV rules apply. So PBV is a part of the General Housing Choice Voucher Program, and most of the HCV rules continue to apply to the PBV program. We're not really going to cover any of the aspects of the PBV program that are the same as HCV today. We're just going over things that are unique about the PBV program. And a lot of that involves the process to initially establish a PBV contract. A lot of what happens after the contract is established is pretty similar to the HCV program. Here I want to highlight 3 important recent statutory changes. What's really key to understand about these is that we've implemented these laws in part, but not yet changed the PBV rules in the Code of Federal Regulations. So if you're working with PBV, you actually need to review Part 983 of the CFR alongside the Federal Register notices implementing these laws in order to accurately understand the PBV program rules. Okay, so the first one is HAPMA. This law was passed in 2016, and since then, HUD has published a series of Federal Register notices to implement and in some cases codify certain provisions of HAPMA. However, there are several HAPMA provisions that have not yet been implemented at all. The 2 implementation notices published in 2017, the Federal Register notices, I should say, make several of the HAPMA provisions affecting PBV effective. So they're already able to be used. Again, I'll highlight PIH Notice 2017-21, which is guidance on these 2 Federal Register notices. So it provides this easier to follow explanation of the implemented provisions that we implemented following HAPMA. We have proposed a rule to actually codify in the CFR all HAPMA provisions affecting project-based vouchers. We made that proposal in 2020, and we're hoping that we will publish a final rule, finally implementing and codifying all of the HAPMA provisions in 2023. The Economic Growth, Regulatory Relief, and Consumer Protection Act, which I tend to just refer to as the Economic Growth Act, was a 2018 law. That changed certain PBV rules for small rural PHAs And those new rules were implemented through a Federal Register notice in February of 2020. HUD has already proposed regulatory changes to incorporate some of these implemented rules into the CFR as part of the overall INSPIRE effort. And we expect a final rule soon for that. But we also expect that there will be another proposed rule soon to codify the remaining Economic Growth Act provisions. So for now, what's important to keep in mind is the 2017-21 PIH notice came out before the Economic Growth Act. So you actually really do have to pay pretty close attention to that February 27th, 2020 Federal Register notice if you are looking for rules specific to small rural PHAs. Okay, final act that was important for PBV was the Fostering Stable Housing Opportunities Amendments, which I call PHA. These were a component of the 2021 Appropriations Act, and the law changed certain PBV rules when a PHA is project-basing Family Unification Program, or FUP, vouchers for former foster youth. Those new rules were implemented again through a Federal Register notice in January of 2022. We're not sure exactly how we're going to codify them in the CFR, but for now, keep in mind you should be looking at the Federal Register notice if you're dealing with FUP vouchers. You will be able to see what's going on with all of these rules, all of these new implementations on the HUD PBV website. That's where we are going to keep the public informed as rulemaking progresses. I just want to highlight a few of the RAD PBV resources that I find particularly helpful. Certainly get a lot of RAD PBV questions, and these are the documents that I tend to look at the most. The RAD notice, obviously, very important. That has all of the waivers that we would need to be aware of in working with PBV through a RAD lens. The relocation notice is extremely important to PBV. A lot of what's going on once the property has actually converted to PBV is covered in that relocation notice. The RAD Resource Desk document library is great. Lots of good information there. I particularly find the reference guide for public housing projects converting to PBV to be helpful. It is more plain language, I find, than a lot of other documents, and I think it provides a good overview of the whole PBV aspect of RAD. We also have published a series of PHA asset repositioning post-closing how-to videos. These are like 10-minute videos or so, going over one by one little aspects of what happens in PBV after a RAD closing. So, you know, choice mobility, 10 minutes on that, things like that. I also find PIH's Office of Field Operations internal monitoring tool to be pretty helpful. This is, you know, only for internal use. It can't be shared with the public, but it is a good comparison of RAD versus RAD PBV. What's the rule in PBV? What's the rule in RAD PBV? So I did put that somewhere where it can be shared among HUD staff. You all should be able to access it. This is a link that you'll be able to get to when we send out the presentation. All right, so this is basically what we're talking about today is this PBV process. And this on the screen is a bird's eye view of the process to project-based, a particular project. You'll notice that 3 of these steps only apply to newly constructed or rehabilitated projects. Sorry. And as it says at the top of the screen, these are not RAD steps exactly. I'll try to highlight as we go through the presentation. I'll use these little red RAD buttons at the top left of the screen. I'll try to highlight where there's a difference for RAD. But you do need to keep in mind that there are additional or different steps for some of these steps when the units are PHA owned, when the project uses a special voucher type, and for RAD. Okay, so just to give you the general overview of what we're going over today, what you can expect a housing authority would generally need to do in order to project base a project is first submit an initial notification to HUD. This is going to be just a preliminary check for HUD to do in order to give the green light for a housing authority to begin a competition. Then there's a competition. There are some exceptions here, but in general, a housing authority needs to competitively select a project for project-based voucher assistance. As soon as the competition has been held and housing authority has a likely candidate in mind for selection, a housing authority needs to conduct a pre-selection inspection, make sure that the project meets some basic quality standards, and also determine whether a project is rehabilitated housing or existing housing in the cases where it could be a little bit unclear. As soon as that determination has been made and the project is determined to have met basic selection, basic quality requirements, then selection can occur. So the housing authority can actually issue a notice to the owner and the public stating that the particular project has been selected for project-based vouchers. Following selection, almost all projects need to undergo environmental review. Make sure there's no environmental hazards that would bar using project-based vouchers at the project. And then for newly constructed or rehabilitated housing, either concurrently with the environmental review or following the environmental review, the housing authority can have HUD or a housing credit agency conduct a subsidy layering review if one is required. A subsidy layering review is only required in a case where project-based voucher assistance is going to be combined with other government assistance of some kind. After completion of the subsidy layering review, in the case of newly constructed or rehabilitated housing, the housing authority and owner execute an agreement to enter into housing assistance payments, or an AHAP. That is a contract that establishes the terms of construction and kind of gives assurance to the owner that the housing authority will project base the units, assuming that construction goes as promised in the AHAP. After the AHAP is entered, construction can occur. As soon as construction is complete, or at least really close to complete, at that point, the housing authority can do a determination of rent. I would typically recommend that wait until construction is fully complete, because a component of determination of rent is the housing authority needs to review the reasonableness of the rent, which is a little hard to do unless you're absolutely certain what features the property contains. So concurrently with the determination of rent, the housing authority can also do the pre-HAP contract inspection. This is the final inspection in order for the housing authority to ensure that the property fully complies with housing quality standards prior to HAP contract execution. There are a couple of exceptions there as well. We'll go over those later. Once those steps have been completed, the housing authority and owner execute the HAP contract, and at that point, occupancy can begin. Families can start moving in, and the property can be operated often for decades, with assisted families moving in and out. And we'll go over a few of the important considerations regarding ongoing occupancy. Before we dive into the process, I want to go through two preliminary matters. PHAs must include information about PBV activities in the PHA's annual plan and must include in the administrative plan PBV specific policies. So all of this really has to be done before a housing authority engages in any effort to project base any particular project. They really have to have a plan to use PBVs for their agency as a whole, and they have to have policies that will govern how to actually bring a PBV project online. So, for instance, competition procedures are required in the administrative plan. So obviously you can't really begin a PBV competition until you actually have those procedures in place. So the box on the slide is some of the general categories that are often needed in the administrative plan. PIH Notice 2017-21 Appendix 2 is extremely helpful on the administrative plan. It contains a pretty comprehensive list of what is required in the administrative plan. But do keep in mind that 2017-21 came out before the small rural PHA and FUP notices in 2020 and 2022. So those 2020 and 2022 Federal Register notices require additional policies that a housing authority needs to implement. Next is the program cap, another important preliminary matter before a housing authority really engages in any project basing of particular projects. A housing authority is limited in how many units it may project base. So a housing authority really needs to carefully consider exactly where they are with relation to this cap that is imposed by statute. So the general rule is PHAs can project base up to 20% of the housing authority's annual contributions contract authorized units. So the number of units that the ACC actually says that a housing authority is eligible to operate, a PHA can project base 20% of those. That's the general rule. Under the Housing Opportunity Through Modernization Act, HOPMA, housing authorities gained the ability to also project base an additional 10% of units, but only if those units are in one of the categories listed on the slide. The units are in a census tract with a poverty rate of 20% or less. The units are specifically made available to house families who are homeless. The units are specifically made available to house families that include a veteran, excuse me, or the units provide supportive housing to persons with disabilities or to elderly persons. So that's what a housing authority is generally working with. What's really important, though, and what has led to a lot of housing authorities actually having much larger percentages of their vouchers committed to project-based vouchers, is that gray exception box on the screen on the bottom left. Units that do not count at all toward the program cap are VASH PBV set-aside units, vouchers awarded specifically for project-based assistance out of the HUD VASH appropriated funding. This is pretty rare. We haven't had an award like this since 2016. But those units are completely excluded, so they are not counted as part of the pool of authorized vouchers, nor are they counted toward the 20% or 10% program caps. Excuse me, just a moment. Okay, sorry about that. RAD units that have been converted to PBV through the rental assistance demonstration, any type, those units are completely excluded from the program cap, not counting toward the denominator or the numerator in the calculation of the program cap. Also, certain previously assisted units that are listed in the Federal Register notice. Most commonly, we're talking about former public housing converted to PBV as part of a repositioning strategy. But there's actually a fairly long list of properties that meet this exception. Excuse me, one more moment. Sorry about that. Okay, and so moving on to the process to project base a particular property. Sorry, I'm losing my voice again. Just a second.
No worries, Eva. Take your moment. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so we're talking about the process to project base a particular property. I'm gonna walk through that flow chart that we went through on slide 6. And we're gonna have these little markers along the way to keep you oriented as to where we are in the process. So first step, notify HUD. Same requirement, regardless of whether the property is existing or newly constructed or rehabilitated. So PIH's Office of Field Operations will review a housing authority's position in relation to the program cap when a PHA submits an initial notification. The housing authority must provide this notification to HUD 14 days before competition or selection. Sorry, give me one more minute.
Of course.
Okay, so before doing a competition or selecting a project in a case where a competition is not required, the housing authority sends a copy of its current status with relation to its program cap to HUD. That notice needs to include an explanation of how many units are excluded from the program cap calculation because they're RAD, VASH, or previously federally assisted. If a housing authority would like, a housing authority can use an optional program cap calculation worksheet that we have available on our website, which instructions for which are in PIH Notice 2017-21, Appendix 1. Next step is the competition, again required regardless whether it's existing housing or newly constructed or rehabilitated housing. The general rule is that housing authorities need to publish a request for proposals and select PBV projects from among the proposals received. There are two exceptions. A PHA can skip the RFP if it has a project in mind that was competitively selected in another comparable competition in the past 3 years, and that prior competition did not consider that the project would have PBVs. The other exception is PHAs can attach PBVs to projects in which the voucher PHA has any ownership interest without competition if the PHA is engaged in an initiative to improve, develop, or replace a public housing property or site. The PHA has to be planning either rehabilitation or construction on the project with a minimum of a $25,000 per unit hard cost, or replacement with existing housing that complies with HQS. So this is a really limited exception. We're talking about when a housing authority is repositioning public housing specifically, and where the voucher housing authority has some kind of ownership interest in the property. It can get a little bit tricky when a public housing only housing authority, one that does not administer an HCV program, is the one repositioning public housing. And PBV voucher contract is going to be administered by a separate housing authority that is housing choice voucher public housing authority. So what we're looking for is this kind of culmination of things, right? The housing authority that has both vouchers and public housing is repositioning its public housing property and then administering the vouchers. That's typically the situation that we're seeing. So very, very limited applicability. One thing that you have to keep in mind here too is that we're talking about an ownership interest, meaning any ownership interest at all, any kind of connection to the property that can be construed as an ownership interest. Owning the land beneath the property, for instance, would be an ownership interest. Having a 1% interest in the property that's otherwise owned by an entirely different entity, that would be an ownership interest for purposes of this non-competitive selection provision only. I really want to emphasize that because it's totally a different definition than PHA-owned. When a project is PHA-owned under the statutory definition, that's going to impact a whole other set of aspects of the PBV program. We'll talk about that in just a second. I will just mention here that for RAD, units are not subject to competitive selection requirements. Okay, so what is PHA-owned and why does it matter? A unit is owned by a public housing agency only if the building, not just the land beneath the building, but the building itself is primarily owned by the PHA or an entity the PHA controls. It's primarily owned by the housing authority if the housing authority has a controlling interest in the property or in the entity that that actually owns the property. So limited definition. It's pretty narrow definition there. It's important because when a property is PHA owned, certain activities normally done by the PHA must instead be done by a third party when the project is PHA owned. A unit of general local government or a HUD-approved independent entity must perform the services on the list on this slide. Really important because of the HQS inspections, the redeterminations of rent. These are a lot of services that are critical and ongoing that an independent entity would need to perform. There's one item on this list, which is the review of the selection process that can be performed by the HUD field office, PIH field office, instead of the independent entity, if the housing authority would like. So for that one only, HUD can be the reviewer. Reviewing the selection process means, right, you're reviewing the competition, if there was one, making sure it was done appropriately according to the rules and the housing authority's administrative plan. If there was no competition, ensuring that the selection was appropriate on the basis of one of the exceptions to the competitive selection process. So once the competition has been put out there, or the housing authority has identified a unit, a property to be targeted for PBV assistance in the case where there is no competition requirement, then the housing authority does need to do a series of checks to ensure that the property actually qualifies for project-based vouchers. It's important for the housing authority to ensure that the units are eligible. Units would be ineligible if they are occupied by the owner, except in the case of cooperative housing, or an ineligible family. So anytime any unit within a property is determined to house an ineligible family, that specific unit cannot be added to the PBV HAP contract. That family can remain, and the housing authority would not project-base that unit. Units associated with penal, medical, educational, or similar institutions generally cannot be project-based. One exception would be for VASH. If it was a VA medical center property, that would be an exception. Manufactured homes are not allowable. Shared or transitional housing is not allowable. And then importantly, most units already subsidized by another program. So we want to prevent a duplication of subsidy. And we're really mostly focused on subsidies that involve an operating cost subsidy. So the public housing program is a great example. Certainly project-based vouchers cannot be attached to public housing units. You could do PBV units in a mixed finance property where only like 20% of the units are public housing. Then PBVs could be okay in the remaining unassisted units, but in general, what we're talking about is any program that subsidizes the operating costs of the property or provides rent in any way cannot be project-based. I think we may have actually identified a type of a 202 project that would be allowable because it doesn't involve any operating subsidy, but I'd have to check my notes on that. But generally, section 202s or 811s, those would not be allowable for project-based vouchers. Units that are in continuum of care subsidy programs where the COC funds are operating funds, those would not be allowable. So it's important for the housing authority to really review that requirement. It's at 983.54 if there's any indication that there's going to be any other kind of subsidy involved in the property.
Hey, Eva, I can fill the gap on that 202.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, it was the first iteration of the 202 program, the pre-1974 202s, they're eligible for project-based vouchers if they prepay their mortgage and do a recapitalization.
Thank you.
Yep. That was the exception. And if it becomes too much, and I know you're struggling, if it becomes too much, we can always reschedule. So don't feel the need yet to keep going on. We can always do a part 2 at another time.
I'm doing okay now. We'll see if I have another.
Okay.
We'll see if I have another episode there.
Good.
All right. Another important aspect is site selection standards. So Housing Authority needs to review the site, make sure that it meets the general statutory criteria, basic fair housing principles, basic HQS principles. So for PBV units, generally, the units need to deconcentrate poverty and expand housing and economic opportunities. A lot of the provisions relating to those specific site selection standards are waived for RAD. The units must provide fair housing, including disability accessibility. And then the HQS site standards are things like making sure that there's no danger to health and safety, noise, environmental problems in the site. Another important characteristic that a housing authority needs to consider before selecting a property is what we call the project cap. Distinct from the program cap, the project cap refers to the number of units within a single property that can be project-based. And I say property, but I really should say project. What we're talking about is project as defined by the Housing Authority. So typically a project is defined as a single building, multiple contiguous buildings, or multiple buildings on contiguous parcels of land. That would be a project under the statutory definition. Housing authorities do have discretion under the PBV program to restrict that definition even further. So for instance, a housing authority's administrative plan could say that only a single building will be considered a project, that a housing authority will not consider adjacent buildings to be a project. That's something that a housing authority could do, but they have some flexibility there. So whatever is determined to constitute the project for purposes of the PBV program will determine what project cap applies. Within a particular project, no more than the greater of 25 units or 25% of units can be project-based. So if the project is made up of 50 units, then 25 units can be project-based because 25 is greater than 25%. If the project is 1,250 units can be project-based because 25% of 1,000 is greater than 25 units. There are some exceptions there. In low poverty census tracts, a housing authority can project-base the greater of 25 units or 40% of units, so long as the HAP contract was effective after the HAPMA effective date of April 18th, 2017. And then units that were previously rent restricted or subject to long-term housing subsidies also are exempt entirely from the project cap. Again, only for HAP contracts after the effective date of HAPMA, April 18th, 2017. Accepted units, which I'll describe on the next slide, are also exempt from the project cap. When a property involves accepted units or units previously under certain rent restrictions or housing subsidies, then the contract could cover up to 100% of the units in the project. There is no cap on the number of units that can receive RAD PBV assistance in a covered project. The mechanism sort of varies a little bit depending on the type of RAD conversion, but as a general rule, there is no cap on the number of units that can be project-based through RAD. Okay, these are accepted units. So the rules depend upon whether the contract was executed before the effective date of the HAPMA provision or after April 18th, 2017. For any contracts that were in effect prior to that date, accepted units can be units reserved for disabled families, elderly families, or families actually receiving supportive services, meaning a family member, at least one, must participate in the supportive services, and the family will be terminated if the family member fails to participate. For HAP contracts effective after April 18th, 2017, then accepted units would either be units exclusively serving elderly families or units housing families eligible for supportive services that are made available to all assisted families in the project. I'm going to go on mute for just a sec. All right, sorry about that. So the big difference there is disabled families no longer a category of accepted units after April 18th, 2017. And for the supportive services exception, after April 18th, 2017, the families merely need to be eligible for supportive services offered in connection with the project. The family does not have to actually accept the services. The housing authority can establish a selection preference for families who qualify for the services, including if they are disability-specific services, provided that the preference is consistent with the PHA plan, non-discrimination, and civil rights rules. A housing authority who was operating a HAP contract prior to April 18th, 2017 may switch categories over to the new HAPMA categories if the owner agrees and if it will not jeopardize any current family's eligibility for continued assistance at the project. So if that happens, a housing authority has to stay with the original categories. So for instance, if the housing authority wanted to remove disabled families, that would be fine so long as no current families are living in units specifically reserved for disabled families on the basis of a disabled family exception. A housing authority is required to refer only qualifying families for occupancy. The owner has to set aside the units specifically for qualifying families for these accepted units. RAD for public housing and mod rehab RAD conversions, the units cannot be accepted under these categories because the units are already excluded entirely from the project cap. For PRAC, though, Units typically fall in the previously federally assisted category, so they're already exempt. But it may be that there might be remaining units that could be accepted, typically under the elderly category. One thing that I want to just point out here that can be confusing is when we say elderly families, we're using the definition of elderly family in the statute and regulations, which is a family in which the head, co-head, spouse, or sole member is age 62 or older, and such a family can include children. It's important to keep in mind because we do see a lot of housing authority, or well, probably more owners, thinking that they can actually use a 55 and older category that excludes children, which would be consistent generally with a Fair Housing Act exception. But that would not be applicable to the PBV program. The housing authority does need to follow the 62 and older head, co-head, spouse, or sole member, and must allow children at the property for PBV properties. In general, it's just a good idea when dealing with age-restricted projects to keep FHEO involved. They can ensure that a project does not run afoul of either the Fair Housing Act or the Age Discrimination Act. Okay, preliminary matters taken care of. Now the housing authority can start with the process of actually selecting a particular project. What's going to be important is for the housing authority to properly categorize whether the property is existing, rehabilitated, or newly constructed. If you remember earlier, I said that there are a few steps that apply only to rehabilitated and newly constructed projects. So it's important for the housing authority to make a determination early in the process of which type of housing they are dealing with, so that they know which steps they need to take in order to project base the property. The critical date for determining what type of project the housing authority is dealing with is the proposal selection date, the date that the housing authority selects a particular property. And what we're looking for is the condition of the units on that date. If on that date, the units substantially comply with housing quality standards, the project is existing housing. If the units exist but do not substantially comply with housing quality standards, the property is rehabilitated housing. Substantially comply is required to be defined by the housing authority in the housing authority's administrative plan. If the units do not exist on the proposal selection date, meaning we either have a tear down structure or just totally vacant land, then the property qualifies as newly constructed housing. This is a little bit less critical for RAD public housing because there's less of a distinction between the steps involved in bringing a property online between existing versus rehab and newly constructed, because there's no AHAP. But it's definitely important for mod rehab and prac because only existing housing is allowed to be project-based. One thing that's a big no-no is for the property to already be under construction on the proposal selection date. If it's already being constructed or rehabilitated, it is ineligible as newly constructed or rehabilitated housing. So in such a situation, the project would not be able to be selected until it qualifies as an existing project. This is something that's about to change. We're about to publish some rules implementing one of the AHAP provisions that has not yet been implemented. But as of right now, on the proposal selection date, it's important that the units not already be under construction. How does the Housing Authority make these determinations? It does it through a pre-selection inspection. Again, remember this would need to be done by a HUD-approved independent entity if the units are PHA-owned. If the project is existing housing, the inspection does need to be a complete inspection. The Housing Authority needs to just figure out how close the property is to meeting HQS. It must substantially comply with HQS in order to be selected as existing housing. For newly constructed or rehabilitated housing, if there's a question about whether it's rehabilitated versus existing, then that pre-selection inspection is important to determine how close the property is to being compliant with HQS for purposes of that substantially compliant definition. Otherwise, what the Housing Authority or independent entity in the case of PHA-owned units is doing is just examining the proposed site, making sure it has adequate streets and utilities, making sure the size, contour, and exposure is suitable for the planned development, and then also making sure that the property meets the site selection requirements that I mentioned earlier. So no environmental hazards, no health and safety issues with the site itself. The date of the selection is the date of written notice of selection to the owner. This gets a little tricky. We're trying to clarify this a little bit more when the unit is PHA owned or when there's no competition. You can sort of substitute in the date of board approval of the selection when there would be no party to actually receive a written notice. One requirement, though, is that the public be promptly notified of the selection results as well. Just remember also that HUD or a HUD-approved independent entity must approve the PHA selection process to determine that the PHA-owned units were appropriately selected before the selection of the unit. PBV units assisted under RAD are not subject to competitive selection requirements. Okay, last step in our flow chart before we break off into the items that apply only to newly constructed or rehabilitated. So for both existing and newly constructed or rehabilitated housing, a housing authority must have an environmental review done. An environmental review is generally required for all PBV units, including existing units at this time, but there's one exception currently in place and one coming. The current exception is small rural PHAs are exempt from this requirement for projects with a total cost of $100,000 or less prior to being placed under the HAP contract. That's covered in the February 27th, 2020 Federal Register notice. HAPMA also contains a provision regarding existing housing environmental reviews, but that provision has not yet been implemented. Assuming an environmental review is required, the PHA must not enter into an AHAP or HAP contract. The owner must not begin work or take any other choice limiting actions on the project until the environmental review concludes in one of the three ways that are listed on the slide. So you need environmental clearance before any choice limiting actions is the takeaway. The PHA must require the owner to carry out mitigating measures required by the responsible entity or HUD if HUD did the environmental review. So anything that needs to happen to mitigate any environmental conditions found does need to be overseen by the housing authority. All right, moving into aspects of the PBV program that apply only to newly constructed or rehabilitated housing. The first step is subsidy layering review. The subsidy layering review can begin while the environmental review is still in progress, if the housing authority would like. And usually the housing authority does want that. So we do see them happening at the same time most of the time. A subsidy layering review is only required if the project is combining project-based voucher assistance with any other federal, state, or local housing assistance, including tax credits. A subsidy layering review is generally performed by HUD. That would be my office, Office of Housing and Voucher Programs. The Financial Management Division would be the one that does that. A housing credit agency, or HCA, that has been approved by HUD can perform the SLR if the project involves tax credits and the project is not a mixed finance project. By mixed finance in this context, I just mean that the project also has public housing units on the same premises. A housing authority can find out if the state HCA has approval by checking the list on HUD's website. I do understand that there are some slight differences in this chain for RAD, but I'm actually not super familiar with them. So you might want to be checking on that separately. What is the point of a subsidy layering review? That is where we ensure that government assistance is not more than the amount needed to make the project feasible. We're looking for reasonable development costs, making sure the debt coverage ratio and cash flow are reasonable. If anything is not reasonable, then the other subsidies going into the property or the PBV rents can be reduced. And then there's a separate review requirement for mixed finance, making sure that public housing funds and other funds are being used proportionately in the project. All of this information is described in much greater detail in the February 28th, 2020 Federal Register Notice. And I especially like Appendix A of that notice, because it lists all of the documents that need to be submitted and also is pretty informative as to what the HCA or HUD is reviewing. Okay, next we are on to the other two steps only applicable to newly constructed or rehabilitated housing, which is the AHAP and construction. The AHAP sets a plan for construction, labor, timing, and rents. It's a contract between the PHA and owner. The owner agrees to develop the contract units to comply with HQS and any additional PHA quality and design requirements. And then the PHA agrees that upon timely completion, the PHA will enter into a HAP contract with the owner. PHAs must not enter HAP contracts if work did not comply with the AHAP requirements. Public housing to PBV RAD units actually enter a HAP contract during the work period with no AHAP requirements. The AHAP is also inapplicable to mod rehab and prac RAD projects because it's not applicable to existing housing. Okay, so for the construction itself, the owner needs to ensure, both the owner and its contractors and subcontractors must ensure, if the AHAP covers 9 or more units, the owner, contractors, and subcontractors must pay Davis-Bacon wages to laborers and mechanics. They also must provide overtime in safe conditions. The contractor is bound by several non-discrimination and equal employment opportunity, I should say, requirements. And then for RAD only, Section 3 of the HUD Act of 1968 applies during the construction period. So Section 3 as a whole generally does not apply to the project-based voucher program, but administratively, HUD has applied Section 3, which regards employment of low-income people, only to RAD during the construction period. Okay, lead-based paint, it's important for that to remember that project-based rental assistance lead rules apply, not the less stringent housing choice voucher rules. So it's really going to mean for rehabilitated projects built before 1978, the housing may be subject to a risk assessment. And if lead-based paint is found, then the lead-based paint must be addressed during construction. The owner also needs to install broadband internet connection infrastructure at the time of any new construction or substantial rehabilitation, not any rehabilitation, only substantial rehabilitation. And this applies only in buildings with more than 4 rental units. So limited applicability on the broadband infrastructure, even where that requirement does apply. Exceptions exist if the location, cost, or housing structure makes installation infeasible. But something definitely to keep in mind early on in project planning. Just a reminder of something I went over earlier is that housing that is eligible for PBVs is also housing that provides accessibility for persons with disabilities. So the PHA should also be monitoring during the construction period any modifications or construction needed to ensure that the project provides accessibility. Okay. We are back on provisions that apply to both existing housing and newly constructed or rehabilitated housing. Next step in the process is determination of rent. So generally, rents cannot exceed the lowest of 3 amounts: the reasonable rent, the rent requested by the owner, or a PHA determined amount. Rent is set by the housing authority or by an independent entity in the case of PHA-owned units. The PHA or independent entity needs to use these 3 categories to determine the rent. Whatever is lowest: reasonable rent, owner requested rent, or PHA determined amount. The PHA determined amount is set based on the PHA's policy in the administrative plan. The PHA's policy can provide for any amount up to 110% of the fair market rent minus any utility allowance. If a PHA uses small area FMRs in its jurisdiction and the PHA's administrative plan provides that the small area FMR will be used for PBVs, then the PHA determined amount must not exceed 110% of the SAFMR minus any utility allowance. If there is an approved exception payment standard in place governing the area in which the PBVs are located, then the PHA determined amount must not exceed the exception payment standard minus any utility allowance. So no matter what kind of situation you're looking at, you're still pretty much looking at three criteria: lowest of reasonable rent, owner requested rent, or PHA determined amount. It's just this PHA determined amount that can vary slightly depending on what circumstances exist with relation to the housing authority's FMR or use of an accepted payment standard. Similar thing when we're talking about tax credits. There's an exception for tax credits where the PHA determined amount must not exceed the tax credit rent minus utility allowance. But this exception does not apply to all tax credit properties. It only applies if the project is not in a qualified census tract. Basically, we're looking for units that are outside of high poverty areas. So if it's in a low poverty area, that's going to meet the first prong of the analysis. If there are comparable tax credit rents that receive no other rental assistance in the project, that's going to be prong 2. And then thirdly, if the rents for those comparable tax credit units exceeds 100%, 110% of the applicable FMR or whatever the approved exception payment standard is. So basically, the PHA determined amount can be an amount up to the tax credit rent minus utility allowance if the units are in a low poverty area, there are non-PBV tax credit units in the property, and the rent for those non-PBV tax credit units is higher than what the PBV units are eligible to receive. This is a provision essentially designed to allow PBV units to pay the full tax credit rent where the tax credit rent is higher than the PBV program rent. The project can be subject to additional rent setting limitations if the units also participate in another federal program that has rent setting requirements, if state or local law limits rents, or if there are rent limitations required as the result of an SLR. Public housing and RAD conversions are subject to alternative requirements. So those alternative requirements further limit the rents that can be offered to the owner. Mod rehab RAD conversions generally are subject to the standard PBV rules, just with a minor exception for 0-bedroom units. Okay, moving on to the last step before the HAP contract, the final inspection before the HAP contract. The HAP contract cannot be executed until all of the PBV units are fully compliant with housing quality standards or have met the requirements of one of the alternatives allowed under HAPMA. Those alternatives are laid out in PIH Notice 2017-20. And the options are for the PHA to allow HAP contract execution for projects that only have non-life-threatening deficiencies or that have been subject to an alternative inspection. We don't see a lot of use of PIH Notice 2017-20. In general, we're looking for units to fully comply with HQS. We might see a little bit more uptake when we revise our regulations to finally codify those alternative policies for HQS. I think the process will be a little bit clearer, so it'll be a little bit more widely used. Difference here for public housing RAD conversions, the conversion commitment will specify the date that the units must comply with HQS rather than requiring the HQS compliance prior to HAP contract execution. Okay, HAP contract can be executed. A HAP contract can only be executed for one project, except in the case of single family scattered site projects. So whatever the housing authority has used as its definition of project, that project will be under one HAP contract, and any other projects that happen to be contracted by the PHA and the same owner would also have to be under separate HAP contracts. So the only exception would be, let's say an owner has 10 single family units across town. All of the single family units are completely scattered. They're not connected to each other. They don't share any common borders. In that case, a HAP contract can cover all of those single family projects. Single family is defined in the PBV rules in a sort of counterintuitive way. It is 4 units or fewer. So if we have 10 4-unit properties all across town, that would be a scattered site single family group of projects, and all of those projects could be under a single HAP contract. Every other case, though, a HAP contract covers one project only. Units that are under a PBV HAP contract are reserved for assisted families for the length of the HAP contract. The PHA and the owner execute the contract, but in the case of PHA-owned units, that can get a little bit tricky because you can't have a contract with yourself. It's not really possible to have a legally enforceable contract when you are both parties to the contract. So the PHA, acting as contract administrator, must have some other separate legal entity serve as the owner in the case of PHA-owned units in order to sign the owner side of the contract. Contracts do need to be on the HUD form. That's going to be the HUD 52530A or B. But some contracts may be out of date. So there are some contracts that were executed prior to April 18th, 2017 that don't contain required statutory language. In those cases, the housing authority and owner actually have to update their contracts to ensure that the statutory language is attached to the contract. The statutory language that I'm talking about is pretty important, actually. It is a provision that requires that upon termination of a HAP contract, the families living in the property have a right to remain with tenant-based assistance. So really impactful provision, really important. It's important that that language is in the contract, so it's very important that housing authorities are using the correct version of the HAP contract form. HAP contracts are able to be executed either as single stage or multi-stage. In the case of a single stage project, meaning all units are done with construction at the same time in one stage, a HAP contract is executed for all units all at the same time. If so, only in the case of newly constructed or rehabilitated projects, a housing authority could execute a multi-stage HAP contract instead. That would need to have been provided for in the AHAP. So what happens in a multi-stage contract is the contract is executed for sets of units as they are completed in stages, as construction is done. So the first stage will determine the anniversary and expiration dates for the entire contract. That first stage date is the HAP contract effective date, and units are just attached onto the HAP contract as they complete construction. An initial HAP contract term can be between 1 and 20 years. There are some limitations on that, some additional requirements for RAD properties. Extensions can be for a cumulative period of up to 20 years each. The language that we used for this particular rule is a little confusing. So what I'm saying here is each extension period can have a cumulative term of up to 20 years. The first extension can be executed anytime during the initial HAP contract term, including on the HAP contract effective date. So let's say that the HAP contract is for 20 years. On day 1 of the contract, the housing authority and owner can execute an extension for 10 years. And that would mean that on day 1 of the HAP contract, the HAP contract term is essentially a 30-year contract term. A couple of years down the road, everything's going well. The owner and PHA can execute the remainder of that cumulative initial extension. So can add another 10 years. So that basically the initial contract term of 20 years plus the initial contract extension comes out to be a total of 40 years. Super confusing, not my favorite provision, as you can tell. But the distinction comes in after a housing authority and owner have executed as many extensions as they want to execute to total 20 years. At that point, all extensions beyond that initial 20-year cumulative extension period are considered subsequent extensions. Subsequent extensions cannot be executed until no more than 2 years prior to the end of the previous extension period. So let's say the initial HAP contract plus the initial extension were 20 years each, meaning the initial contract period with the initial extension was a 40-year period. On year 38, that is when the housing authority and owner can begin executing subsequent extensions. Each extension at that point can then be up to 20 years cumulatively. So basically what we see most often for most housing authorities is we see on day one a 40-year contract term, and at year 38 an additional 20 years tacked on. So we're sort of expecting to see at any given time probably another 20-year extension is going to be in effect. This is a hard one. We get a lot of questions about this one. It's confusing. It's not you. Hopefully we'll clarify this a little bit better in our new rule that we expect to come out in 2023. Anytime a housing authority agrees to an extension, it has to be on the basis of a PHA determination that extension is appropriate to continue providing affordable housing for low-income families. Contract length and extensions must be agreed upon by an independent entity if the units are PHA-owned. For RAD, depending on the type, there might be different requirements for whether extensions are required and the length of any of those extensions. Okay, changes during the HAP contract term. A HAP contract generally can be amended at any time to add units to the contract. However, the units are still subject to normal PBV requirements, except for the competition requirement. PBV units at any time during the contract can be substituted for comparable units after the comparable units have gone through an HQS inspection and a determination of rent reasonableness. This is totally at the PHA's discretion. The owner cannot require substitution of units. This is often referred to as floating. However, it does vary a little bit from the general use of the term floating, because under the PBV program, any changes to contract units actually require an amendment to the HAP contract. So the housing authority and owner actually need to amend the HAP contract to write in which unit has been removed from the contract and which unit has been substituted if they're doing a substitution. So that's really the distinction between what we call floating in the PBV program and what other programs may consider to be floating. Units can be removed from the HAP contract by the housing authority if the units do not meet HQS, if the units have been vacant for more than 120 days, or if there are certain issues affecting a particular family, which I'll discuss in a moment. Definitely some differences here for RAD. HUD approval is required to reduce the number of contract units. Floating units would not require the contract amendment. There's no option to add units to a RAD contract. It's a RAD contract only involves the units originally on the converting property. Contract termination. The HAP contract normally terminates at the time the term expires, or is whenever the HAP contract is just not extended. PHAs can terminate the HAP contract if it has insufficient funding, but only after taking all cost-saving measures that HUD prescribes. The HAP contract also provides for other scenarios in which the PHA or HUD can choose to terminate a HAP contract. Largely, we're talking about owner breach. The owner has the option to terminate the HAP contract if the rent to owner is reduced below the initial rent to owner. So if the housing authority does its regular calculation of rent to owner and determines that the rent maybe is not reasonable anymore and needs to be reduced below initial rent to owner, the owner has the option to terminate the contract if that happens. For this reason, the PHA can provide for a rent floor in the HAP contract, which prevents the contract from having a rent reduced below initial rent to owner in most cases, and we'll go over that a little bit later. Owners must give a 1-year notice to before terminating a HAP contract to families so that the families know it's coming. Upon that 1-year notice, the families need to be able to remain in their units with no increase in the tenant portion of their rents. Families also need to be offered tenant-based vouchers at the time of HAP contract termination, and the families have the right to remain in the project with those tenant-based vouchers as long as the units are used for rental housing and are otherwise eligible for HCV assistance. Owners cannot terminate the tenancy of a family that exercises its right to remain except for good cause. There are definitely some impacts here. Check out the RAD use agreement for RAD specific impacts. All right, HAP contract has been executed, project is online, ready to go. Now we get to occupancy. And as I was mentioning earlier, occupancy is often 40 years initially, and then 60, and then 80. You know, projects can be available as project-based voucher housing for a really long time. So there's actually quite a bit here on the occupancy side. In order to occupy units, families must be selected from the waiting list. The housing authority must administer the waiting list. There is a HOTMA provision that has not yet been implemented that will allow owner-maintained waiting lists, but just sit tight for that, hoping that'll come out again in 2023. PHAs have a choice whether to maintain one waiting list or separate HCV and PBV waiting lists. If it has a PBV waiting list, a PBV list can be site-based or can be PBV program-wide. PBV lists can also be merged with the list of another assisted housing program, such as a public housing program. The PHA can establish waiting list preferences in the administrative plan, and the preferences for the PBV program or for particular PBV units or projects may differ from the preferences for the housing choice voucher waiting list. The PHA is required to establish preferences for accepted units. Those are those elderly, disabled, or supportive services units. When the project is first occupied, the PHA fills the units in the order on the screen. So eligible families residing in the proposed contract unit on the selection date must be given an absolute selection preference and referred to the owner for an appropriately sized unit. Might not be the one that they're occupying, but they do need to be referred for occupancy of a PBV unit. Then the PHA goes to the waiting list. If there is a separate waiting list for the PBV program, The PHA must offer to place applicants who are already on the HCV waiting list onto the PBV waiting list when the PBV waiting list is established. After that, new applicants can be added to the waiting list. Within the waiting list, the PHA will administer any preferences the PHA has established to determine which families to refer to the owner first. In selecting families to occupy units with accessibility features for persons with disabilities, the PHA must first refer families who need the features for occupancy of the accessible units. For calculating the tenant portion of the rent, what trips people up a lot is that the voucher program typically uses payment standards as part of a rent calculation. That is not the case in the PBV program. Payment standards are not part of rent calculation at all in the PBV program. Families in a PBV unit always pay their total tenant payment, their TTP, for rent and utilities. It's a pretty simple calculation. One exception there is for mixed families, meaning families that contain some ineligible non-citizens. Those families pay a prorated rent. So since the tenant rent is so simple, and I guess I should say also that if the utility allowance minus the TTP equals a positive balance, then you're in a utility reimbursement situation. So basically the TTP is so low that it doesn't even cover all of the utilities. Then the housing authority needs to pay the difference between the utility allowance and the TTP to either the family or the utility provider to cover the rest of the utilities. The housing assistance payment is calculated as rent to owner minus tenant rent. Simpler calculation here. The utility allowances must be the same as the Housing Choice Voucher Program in general for PBV. So no option to have a site-based utility allowance. Differences for RAD though, for public housing, RAD conversions, rent increases for families can be subject to phase-in requirements, and there is a provision for site-based utility allowances. Leasing up. The housing authority needs to conduct an oral briefing when a family accepts an offer of assistance, and the family needs to get a statement of family responsibility. The family executes the lease and tenancy addendum for the unit. The HAP contract is already in place, so there's no additional HAP contract for each family as there would be in HCV. All that's happening when a particular family is leasing up is the family is executing a lease and tenancy addendum. The lease has to provide for automatic renewal. So the family would generally stay in that unit as long as the family wants. The owner can only terminate the lease for one of the reasons in the box, basically for cause. The tenant could choose to terminate the lease. If the family's assistance is terminated, that would terminate the lease. So on and so forth. But there's no option for the owner to just simply decide at the end of a lease term, it's not going to renew the lease. A couple of things that could happen regarding particular families. So if a family's annual reexamination shows that the family's income has increased enough so that the family can now pay the full rent, basically the TTP now exceeds the rent and utilities, then the family is no longer eligible for housing assistance payments. In such a case, the PHA needs to terminate the family's assistance once 180 consecutive days have passed since the last HAP. If the project is comprised of 100% PBV units, then the PHA may choose to reinstate the unit after the ineligible family vacates the property. If not all units in the property, are PBVs, then the PHA can choose to substitute a different unit in the property. For public housing RAD conversions, the initial family is exempt from this requirement. Okay, for families that are occupying an accessible or wrong-sized unit that the family doesn't need, the family must be offered a voucher, another PBV unit, or other assistance to move from that wrong-sized unit or the unit that has accessibility features that the family doesn't need, but a disabled family needs. The housing assistance payments terminate for the PBV unit as soon as the family moves or if the voucher term expires, whichever is earlier. If the family does not vacate the unit by the expiration of the voucher term, the PHA has to remove the unit from the HAP contract. In RAD projects, the initial family actually can remain in the unit until the right size unit becomes available in the project. It doesn't, so this is slightly different for RAD. Accepted units, similar kind of situation. So only families that are actually eligible for accepted units can actually move into them. So if the unit is accepted elderly, only an elderly family can move in, for example. But what can happen is it can turn out that the family no longer qualifies after move-in. For instance, the only elderly member of the family could be hospitalized or otherwise leave the household, so that the remaining members no longer qualify for the accepted unit. If that happens, the PHA has to stop providing HAP and the family needs to vacate. If the family fails to vacate, the owner can evict the family, the PHA can substitute another unit on the HAP contract, or the PHA can remove the unit from the HAP contract. We do have some limitations here. If a family has successfully completed supportive services offered in connection with the project, and that's why the family no longer qualifies for a supportive services unit, then the family is able to remain in the accepted unit. And then at the PHA option, the PHA may provide in its administrative plan that remaining members can stay if the elderly or disabled family member leaves the household. Eligibility for housing choice vouchers. So the family can terminate the assisted lease after the first year by giving the owner and the PHA a written notice of intent to vacate. The PHA must give the family priority for the next available housing choice voucher or comparable tenant-based rental assistance if the family requests continued assistance before providing notice to terminate the lease. This is referred to as choice mobility in RAD. Slight difference for RAD public housing conversions is that there can be a turnover cap that limits the number of families moving with continued rental assistance. There's one exception to the general rules here for all PBV families, and that's the requirement to provide written advance notice before vacating the property. That does not apply in the case of VAWA covered crimes where the move is for family safety. Okay. Housing assistance payment contract can provide for vacancy payments. In all cases, when a family moves out, the owner is allowed to keep the HAP for the remaining portion of the month in which the family moves out, unless the vacancy is the fault of the owner, which is rare. So, however, a housing authority has discretion to agree in the HAP contract to then continue to pay rent to the owner for vacant units for up to 2 months after the month in which the assisted occupant moves out. The PHA sets the amount of the vacancy payments in the admin plan. It can be less than the rent to owner would have normally been, but in no circumstances can the amount be greater than the rent to owner minus any payments for rent that the owner actually received from the family. The PHA policy determines how the owner requests a vacancy payment, and the housing authority makes vacancy payments using regular HAP funding. We're running pretty low on time, so I'm going to skip over our systems information, but there's great information on systems in Appendix 3 of PIH Notice 2017-21. And would definitely recommend paying attention to RAD notices on VMS reporting because it's a little different during the initial year. Okay, ongoing housing quality standard inspections. A housing authority needs to continue to conduct inspections throughout the contract term. All inspections need to be done by an independent entity in the case of PHA-owned housing. Inspections include as needed inspections, like when there's a possible breach of HQS, turnover inspections, meaning whenever a new family is about to move into a unit, and then periodic regular inspections. So PHAs for these regular inspections need to inspect a random sample of at least 20% of the contract units in each building, at least biennially. Just a second. So once a housing authority has done this biennial sample inspection, depending on what happens in that inspection will determine the policy for reinspection. So as long as most of the units pass the inspection, then all the housing authority needs to do is just follow up on identified HQS defects. However, if 20% or more of the sampled units then fail the inspection, the PHA needs to inspect every PBV contract unit in the property. The biennial sample is required for most housing authorities, but for small rural PHAs, it's every third year, triennially. HUD PHAs can rely on alternative inspection methods such as tax credit, home, or other HUD inspections, and can request HUD approval for other inspection methods beyond tax credit, home, or HUD inspections. Redetermination of rent. A housing authority is required to redetermine the rent to owner if the owner requests a redetermination at the anniversary, anytime there's a 10% decrease in the FMR, or if rent has been determined to be unreasonable. The housing authority needs to redetermine rent reasonableness anytime there is a 10% decrease in the FMR, a change in responsibility for utilities, a substitution of contract units or floating, or any other change that can substantially affect rent. So these are kind of tied together, right? Redetermination of rent could trigger rent reasonableness redetermination, or the other way around. Rent reasonableness determination could trigger a redetermination of rent. That's because you use the same calculation to redetermine the rent as you used at initial rent determination. So the PHA or independent entity is looking at the lower of the rent requested by the owner, the reasonable rent, or the PHA determined amount. Okay, and then a housing authority can provide in the HAP contract that rent will not be reduced below the initial rent, except to correct initial rent calculation errors if required by a subsidy layering review, or if tenants are made responsible for utility costs previously paid by the owner. For public housing RAD conversions, a rent floor is automatically applicable, not at the discretion of the PHA. Okay, I have left not a lot of time for questions, but let's see what you have and we'll see what we can get to.
Eva, thank you so much for going through the PBV program in the detail that you covered. But yeah, folks, I know it's a lot of information, but I think really useful to understand, how the assets we work on and the properties we work on, the program that they go to. And I thought, Eva, you did a great job of showing, all the different kind of rules and regulations and ongoing kind of compliance on the housing authority that has to occur for the PBV program. So any questions, folks? Susanna and then Jerome.
Hi, thank you. My question is, I have a delayed conversion agreement where the PHA is ready to execute their PBV HAP contract, but Exhibit C shows the tenants as paying their own electricity, even though they have a utility allowance in their rent schedule. So my question was, when there's a utility allowance, can the HAP still show the things like electricity and water sewer as tenant paid, or must all utilities be owner paid?
Yeah, no, tenants can definitely be paying their own utilities under a HAP contract. In fact, the only time you're going to see a utility allowance is if the tenants do have tenant paid utilities. So the purpose of the utility allowance is to ensure that the housing authority is providing enough subsidies so that the tenant can pay their tenant tenant paid utilities. So, let's say a family's total tenant payment is $100 and the tenant is responsible for their own electricity, but not gas. Then whatever the housing authority's utility allowance for electricity is, that will be deducted from that $100 amount. So let's say that's $20 a month. That will mean that the family then pays $80 in rent.
Gotcha. Okay, so it's okay to see that. I thought it was the other way around where they shouldn't have any tenant paid, but thank you for clarifying.
Sure, yeah.
Hi, Eva. Thank you for your presentation. It was great. My question stems from the pre-HAP contract inspection stage. I have a PHA now that has a HAP, a HCV administrator, and they're telling the administrator that they are responsible for hiring the HQ not hiring, but administering the HQS inspection through the independent entity, and also that they are to bring the units up to compliance. So I just wanted to get clarity on that.
I think I'm having a little bit of trouble following. What entity is
They, the PHA has someone managing their vouchers after conversion. So.
okay? So there's
There's
there's a different contract administrator than the PHA that's actually converting units through RAD. Is that what you're
Correct.
saying?
That's
Okay.
correct.
Okay.
So the administrator is being told that they are responsible for the HQS inspection and bringing the units up to compliance.
Okay.
But this is pre-conversion, RAD
Yeah.
conversion.
So the contract administrator is absolutely always responsible for conducting all housing quality standard inspections. That's the contract administrator or HCV PHA. That's their responsibility, is to conduct inspections. Now, if the project is PHA owned, then it's the HCV PHA's responsibility to get HUD approval for an independent entity to conduct those inspections. But the HCV PHA, the contract administrator, would then be responsible for paying the independent entity if payment is required in order to do those inspections. So the inspection function is part of the contract administration duty that the HCV Housing Authority must complete at all stages of the PBV process. However, the actual work on the units, that is the owner's responsibility. So it gets a little bit confusing if the current owner is just like some other housing authority. In terms of how our program considers it, the PHA that actually runs the units currently is technically the owner under PBV program rules. And it is the owner's responsibility to actually do any kind of work on the units to bring them into compliance with HQS.
Great. Thank you for the clarity.
Okay, sure. No, we're at the end of our time. I'm happy to stay on if there are more questions.
And folks, if you think of questions as you step away, feel free to shoot us a note and we can always put those forward to Eva. She's always so helpful in responding to our questions on the PBV program.
Yep, definitely happy to take other questions.
Eva, thanks again for doing this for us. Very, very insightful.
I'm glad you found it helpful. Yeah, hope to hope it continues to be helpful as you keep working with these projects.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Okay.